Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Margaret Beaufort. Margaret is believed to have initiated discussions with Elizabeth Woodville via a mutual physician, who conveyed secret correspondences between the two women. Together, they conspired to supplant King Richard, and by joint force replace him with Margaret's son Henry Tudor. Their solidified alliance further secured the subsequent dynasty by the agreed betrothal of Margaret's son Henry to the Dowager Queen's daughter, Elizabeth of York. They hoped this proposal would attract both Yorkist and Lancastrian support against King Richard. Think of it like Romeo and Juliet, but if it were planned by two adult women, so the plan was better thought out and everybody didn't just die. In 1483, Margaret was certainly involved, if not the mastermind behind, Buckingham's rebellion against Richard. She has been described as the Athena of the rebellion. Perhaps with duplicitous motives, he may have been desirous of the crown for himself. Buckingham conspired with Beaufort and Woodville to dethrone Richard. Margaret's son was set to sail from Brittany to join forces with him, but he arrived too late for this rebellion, and the rebellion failed. Henry escaped back to France. The two York princes in the Tower were at least heard during their attempted breakout from the Tower, but they were also never seen again. Richard transferred Margaret's property to her husband, Lord Stanley, as punishment, meaning, although he could have taken everything she had for her treasonous behavior and this rebellion, and have her killed, instead, he put her in the care of her husband. She needed a babysitter and couldn't be trusted. He also effectively imprisoned Margaret in her husband's home, with the hope of preventing any further correspondence with her son. However, her husband failed to stop Margaret's continued communication with her son. When the time came for Henry to press his claim, he relied heavily on his mother to raise support for him in England. Henry then returned to England one more time in an attempt to depose King Richard III, who by this point was fairly unpopular with nearly everyone. The Stanleys had been communicating with the exiled Henry Tudor for some time. Henry's stepfather was indeed very good at playing both sides, and that is exactly what was happening here. Henry Tudor was able to land in Wales and found that he had support there. If you remember, when he was a baby, he had been born in Wales. The Tudors had support in Wales, and people remembered his father there, and his march through Wales wasn't contested at all. When Richard found out about Henry's unopposed march through Wales, he ordered the Stanleys to join him against Henry. Stanley said he couldn't make it because he had come down with a sweating sickness. My guy was calling in fake sick to work. He wasn't really sick. And Richard didn't buy it. He called BS. Richard had Stanley's son, who was not successful escaping court, and his son, Margaret's stepson, admitted to everything that his father and uncle had been up to. Richard kept him hostage and said that he would die if Stanley didn't fall back in line and support Richard. Margaret's husband Stanley responded, "Sire, I have other sons." I imagine Richard III was like, "Wait, I'm the bad guy in this story. What are you doing, bro? Cold-hearted. I have other sons?" He was just like, "Not my problem." Lord Stanley ended up siding with his stepson Henry. He did this by just refusing to help King Richard. He didn't even fight. He just showed up and stood there with his army, and they just watched Henry defeat King Richard at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry won. Richard was dead. And Stanley had plausible deniability, just in case it didn't go that way. He could have been like, it was the sweating sickness. I don't know. I was trying to fight. I couldn't. I don't even know with him. The king is dead. Long live the king. This is where you would insert the part in Shakespeare's play, Richard III. It's a famous line, and it's also the last line that Richard III speaks in the play. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. A villain in Shakespeare's history plays, Richard III departs the stage and his life with these words, fighting to his death on foot after losing his horse in battle. The Battle of Bosworth ended the Wars of the Roses after 32 years. But it also ended the Middle Ages. This is generally seen as the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance in England. Peace will do that for you. When you don't have to focus on war, you can focus on art and music and knowledge. Henry decided that he hadn't become king at the Battle of Bosworth. He decided he had been king from the day before the Battle of Bosworth, making everyone who fought against him on that day guilty of treason. It was a sneaky move. Legally, he could have them all killed and take all of their property because they were treasonous, even though on that day they were attempting to not be treasonous by fighting for their king as they saw it. He wasn't messing around. The York years were short, only 32 years. It only lasted one generation, really, from Edward to his brother Richard. And Edward's son, who was a child in the Tower and technically was king, but only ever king from prison, and then he went missing. So I guess you could say 2 generations, but that's a stretch. Every English monarch until today is descended from King Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the old King Edward. Their marriage did exactly what it was supposed to do. It united the houses of York and Lancaster. The Tudor rose is a symbol of this unity. The York and the Lancastrian roses were white and red, and the Tudor rose was a mixture. It's a red and white rose, symbolizing that York and Lancaster were together again. After her son's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Margaret was referred to as My Lady the King's Mother. That was her official title. Everyone had to call her that, My Lady the King's Mother. Her son's parliament changed her status and granted Beaufort considerable legal and social independence from men. She was, after all, an early feminist, and she was allowed to own property separately from her husband, as though she were unmarried or as though she were a man, and sue in court, 2 rights denied to contemporary married women. As arranged by their mothers, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of King Edward IV. Margaret was reluctant to accept a lower status than the Dowager Queen Elizabeth, or even her daughter-in-law, the Queen Consort. But she had never been an anointed queen, so both her daughter-in-law and her daughter-in-law's mother, who had outranked her. Margaret Beaufort probably still remembered that these women were the daughter and granddaughter of Jacquetta of Luxembourg. If you need a refresher, she's got an episode. They were Lancastrian women pretending to be York women. And Margaret would recognize that as a Lancastrian woman who pretended to be a York woman for so long. She wore robes of the same quality as the Queen Consort and walked only half of a pace behind her. Margaret lived in the quarters meant for the Queen. The Queen had to have other apartments made for her. She probably wasn't the most fun mother-in-law to have. Henry and Elizabeth's first son, Arthur, was born 8 months after their wedding. He was named for the legendary King Arthur. This was the start of a new age. Margaret had written her signature as M. Richmond for years, since the 1460s. In 1499, she changed her signature to Margaret R. Perhaps for Margaret Richmond, but more likely the R stood for Regina, Queen in Latin, as customarily employed by female monarchs. Or for Richmond, plausible deniability again. She was like, you know what? The R means what it means. Figure it out yourself. Many historians believe the departure from court of Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville in 1487 was partially at the behest of Henry's influential mother. Margaret wouldn't have appreciated that the new queen's mother outranked her. Margaret would have had to bow not only to her daughter-in-law, the queen, but also her daughter-in-law's mother, and she would not have liked that. The royal couple had another baby just 3 years later, Margaret, named after her grandmother. In 1490, a young Flemish man named Perkin Warbeck appeared and claimed to be Richard Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes in the Tower, the ones who had gone missing. Warbeck had convinced King Edward's sister in Burgundy that he was her missing nephew, and if this was true, this would mean he escaped Richard, and now he was grown, and he was back to avenge his father and brother's death. He had backing from the Scottish crown, because they were always up for messing with England. And in 1497, he landed in Cornwall with a few thousand troops, but he was soon captured and executed. Stanley was accused of supporting Warbeck's cause. After £10,000 and a collar of a livery with Yorkist garnishings were found amongst his belongings. He was arrested and executed. And because of his closeness to Stanley, the king instituted a more rigid security for access to him. Stanley had, after all, been his stepfather. In 1499, Henry had his wife's cousin executed to ensure the throne before his son Arthur's wedding. Edward, Earl of Warwick, was executed, reportedly for trying to escape the Tower, but it likely was because he was a threat to the throne. His claim was stronger than that of the new King Henry. He was the only male heir that could make a claim as strong as Perkin Warbeck had. He spared Edward's older sister Margaret. Women weren't really a threat for the throne like men were, so he allowed her to live, but her brother was executed. So, back to baby making. The royal couple had Henry, the future King Henry VIII, in 91. Henry was originally his brother's spare. Most spares weren't needed to be a spare. So the long-term plan for Henry was that he was going to be a bishop and hopefully, someday, a cardinal, and maybe the pope. This Henry is the Henry who grows up to be King Henry VIII, the man who married 6 times, beheaded 2 of his wives, and literally invented another religion to allow him to divorce. This man was probably not meant to be pope. I can't with that alternate reality. That would be an interesting story. Right now, though, he was a little boy who loved God and his grandmother, Margaret Beaufort. She had missed so much of her own son Henry's life. She had a great time with her grandson Henry. They were very close. My niece always talks about her grandma being her best friend, and I feel like little Henry Tudor felt the exact same way. The royal couple had another baby, Elizabeth, in 92, but she only lived to be 2 years old. Then they had Mary in 96 and Edmund in 99, but he died when he was only 1. Later in the marriage, Margaret preferred living alone, before Stanley, of course, had been executed. In 1499, with her husband's permission, she had taken a vow of chastity. Just like, basically, we're married, but I'm a nun now, dude. And he was like, okay, cool. Taking a vow of chastity while being married was unusual, but not unprecedented. The Countess had moved away from her husband and lived alone, which is probably when he got into all his trouble with Perkin Warbeck. But she was regularly visited by him, because he played both sides, and she had rooms reserved for him where she was. Margaret renewed her vows in 1504 when her husband was killed for treason for backing Perkin Warbeck. She was like, now I'm like really, really a nun, because I don't have a husband in the way anymore. Margaret Beaufort set forth the protocols with everything from marriage to childbirth to the raising of children. She was the maternal expert of the family. Margaret's oldest grandson married Catherine of Aragon on the 14th of November, 1501. Arthur, 15, and Catherine, 16, both wore white satin at their wedding. Following the ceremony, they went to Baynard's castle, where they were entertained by the best-voiced children of the king's chapel, who sang right sweetly, with quaint harmony. All Margaret's doing. She had a plan, and that's how things were going to go. What followed was a bedding ceremony, also designed by Margaret Beaufort, the groom's grandmother. The bed was sprinkled with holy water, after which Catherine was led away from the wedding feast by her ladies-in-waiting. She undressed, veiled, and reverently laid in bed, while Arthur, in his shirt, with a gown cast about him, was escorted by his gentlemen into the bedchamber as they played music. The Bishop of London then blessed the bed and prayed for the marriage to be fruitful, after which the couple were left alone. What the actual F, Grandma? Too far. Way too far. Why are you all up in everyone's business? Luckily for everyone else, this is the only recorded public bedding ceremony in the country in the 16th century. But, holy moly. Arthur and Catherine resided at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches, with his mother's cousin Margaret Pole, the daughter of George and Isabel, as her lead lady-in-waiting. In March 1502, Arthur and Catherine were affected by an unknown illness. It was described as a malign vapor which processes from the air. It has been suggested that it may have been the sweating sickness, tuberculosis, plague, or influenza. Or, as usual, poison, but probably not this time. While Catherine recovered, Arthur did not. She recovered to find out that she was now a widow. He had died in 1502 at Ludlow Castle. He was 15 and a half. Margaret Beaufort and her daughter-in-law conspired to prevent Elizabeth and Henry's daughter, Margaret, from being married to the Scottish king at too young of an age. Margaret Beaufort was undoubtedly resolved that her granddaughter should not share her fate, referring to her marriage at 12. So she may have been a bit overbearing, but also she was a protective mama bear when it came to her child or grandchildren. 1503, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby daughter named Catherine on February 2nd. 9 days later, Elizabeth died, probably of childbed fever, the infection that so often followed births of that time. And just 1 week later, baby Catherine also passed. After Elizabeth's death in 1503, Margaret became the principal female presence at court. When Arthur died, Margaret played a part in ensuring that her grandson Henry was the new heir apparent and was raised appropriately by selecting some members of his new household. He was about to change majors from the Catholic religion to poli-sci. The Countess was known for her education and her piety. Biographers Jones and Underwood claim that the entirety of Beaufort's life can be understood in the context of her deeply felt love and loyalty to her son. They were very close. They had, in a way, grown up together. Henry is said to have been likewise devoted. Henry VII died on the 21st of April, 1509. Having designated his mother chief executrix of his will, for 2 days after the death of her son, Margaret scrambled to secure a smooth succession for her grandson, Henry VIII. Yes, that exact Henry VIII. The king is dead. Long live the king. But not all of his wives. Maybe you've heard. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. We're in for a rocky road. She arranged her son's funeral and her grandson's coronation. When her 18-year-old grandson chose members of his privy council, it was Margaret's suggestions that he took. Margaret had been ill for several days. As legend had it, after eating a young swan for dinner, the Countess died in Westminster Abbey on the 29th of June, 1509. This was the day after her grandson Henry VIII's 18th birthday, 5 days after his coronation, and just 2 months after the death of her own son. Margaret was survived by her grandson, King Henry VIII. Through him, she was the great-grandmother of 3 more monarchs, King Edward VI, Queen Mary I, and Queen Elizabeth I. And through her granddaughters, she was the ancestor of every other monarch that followed until modern day. And that is where we will leave it for this week. Margaret led an extraordinary life and navigated tough times with very little experience or training. She became a mother at 13 and didn't even have the assistance of a spouse. She then helped get that baby from exile to the throne of England. She styled herself a queen, but I think she earned that. Was she a little controlling? Absolutely. But she loved her son more than anything. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.